My name is Sarah, and at 32 years old, I thought I had the perfect marriage. That was until I found the receipt for a hotel room I had never been to, tucked inside my husband David's jacket pocket while doing laundry. What I discovered next would shatter everything I believed about my 10-year marriage. But more importantly, it would reveal just how cunning my seemingly devoted husband really was. If you think you know how this story ends, trust me, you don't. The revenge I served was colder than any dish ever imagined. 10 years ago, I met David Richardson at a corporate networking event in downtown Seattle. I was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree, working as a junior marketing coordinator at a tech startup. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David was 28, already making his mark as a financial advisor at one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. He had this way of commanding attention when he walked into a room, not through arrogance, but through genuine confidence and charm that drew people to him like moths to a flame. I still remember what I was wearing that night, a simple black dress I had borrowed from my roommate because I couldn't afford anything suitable for such an upscale event. David approached me during the cocktail hour, commenting on how I seemed to be the only person actually listening to the keynote speaker instead of networking. We talked for hours about everything from market trends to our shared love of hiking in the Pacific Northwest. When the event ended, he walked me to my car, a beat-up Honda Civic that looked embarrassingly out of place among the BMWs and Mercedes in the parking garage. Our first official date was the following weekend. David picked me up in his sleek black Audi and took me to this intimate Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill that I had walked past countless times but could never afford to enter. He was the perfect gentleman, pulling out my chair, asking thoughtful questions about my career aspirations, and genuinely seeming interested in my answers. When I mentioned that I was saving money to eventually start my own marketing consultancy, his eyes lit up with enthusiasm rather than the polite disinterest I had grown accustomed to from other dates. The courtship that followed was like something out of a romantic movie. David would send flowers to my office for no reason other than he was thinking of me. He remembered small details from our conversations, like how I preferred coffee shops with exposed brick walls, or how I had always wanted to learn to ski but never had the money for lessons. 3 months into our relationship, he surprised me with a weekend trip to Whistler, complete with a private skiing instructor and gear that must have cost more than my monthly rent. I fell hard and fast, perhaps too fast. David represented everything I had dreamed of, but never dared to hope for: stability, success, and someone who seemed to genuinely care about my happiness and future. He came from old Seattle money, the kind of family that had generational wealth tied up in real estate and investments. His parents, Robert and Margaret Richardson, lived in a sprawling estate in Bellevue that looked like something from a magazine spread. When David first brought me home to meet them 6 months into our relationship, I was terrified they would see right through me to the middle-class girl from Tacoma, who had worked 3 jobs to put herself through college. To my surprise, they welcomed me warmly. Margaret, elegant in the way that only comes from a lifetime of privilege, seemed genuinely interested in my background and career goals. Robert, a distinguished man with silver hair who had built his fortune in commercial real estate, treated me with the same respect he showed everyone else. Over dinner that first evening, they shared stories about David's childhood, his academic achievements, and his rapid rise at the investment firm. I could see the pride in their eyes when they talked about their son, and I felt honored to be included in their family circle. The proposal came 18 months after we met, on a crisp autumn evening at Cary Park, overlooking the Seattle skyline. David had planned everything perfectly, down to having a photographer hidden nearby to capture the moment. The ring was stunning, a 2-carat diamond solitaire set in platinum that must have cost more than I made in a year. As he knelt in front of the iconic view of the Space Needle and Mount Rainier, telling me he couldn't imagine his life without me, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Our wedding was held at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel downtown, a lavish affair with 300 guests. David's parents insisted on paying for everything, brushing off my concerns about the expense with gentle but firm assurance that they wanted their son's wedding to be perfect. My own parents, a school teacher and an electrician from Tacoma, seemed overwhelmed by the opulence but tried their best to fit in. The ceremony was beautiful, officiated by a family friend who had known David since childhood, and the reception lasted until well past midnight, with live jazz music and champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. After the wedding, we moved into a beautiful craftsman-style home in Queen Anne that David had purchased as a wedding gift to me. It was everything I had ever dreamed of: hardwood floors, a gourmet kitchen with granite countertops, and a view of Elliott Bay from the master bedroom. David had surprised me by setting up one of the spare bedrooms as my home office, complete with top-of-the-line computer equipment, and everything I would need to eventually launch my consulting business. The early years of our marriage were blissful. David encouraged me to leave my job at the startup and focus on building my own company. He provided the initial investment capital and helped me navigate the complexities of business formation, licensing, and establishing credit lines. Within 2 years, I had built a small but successful marketing consultancy, specializing in helping emerging tech companies develop their brand strategies. My clients were thriving, and I was finally doing work that felt meaningful and challenging. David's career was also flourishing. He had been promoted to senior financial advisor and was managing portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. His specialty was working with high net worth individuals and families, helping them preserve and grow generational wealth. The trust his clients placed in him was evident in the steady stream of referrals and the impressive returns he was generating for their investments. We were invited to exclusive charity galas, joined the country club, and spent our vacations at luxury resorts, in destinations I had only seen in travel magazines. By our 5th anniversary, we had settled into a comfortable routine. David would leave for the office by 7 each morning, impeccably dressed in custom-tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. I would work from my home office, building client relationships and developing marketing strategies for companies that were just beginning to make their mark in the competitive Seattle tech scene. Evenings were often spent entertaining clients or attending social events related to David's work, but we always made time for quiet dinners together and weekend getaways to our cabin on Lake Chelan that we had purchased in our 3rd year of marriage. We talked about starting a family, but David always seemed to find reasons to postpone. First, it was his career trajectory. He was up for a partnership at the firm and wanted to secure that before taking on the responsibilities of fatherhood. Then it was my business. He argued that I had worked too hard to build my consultancy to put it on hold for children. When I pressed the issue in our 6th year of marriage, he suggested we wait until we had paid off the mortgage on the lake house and established college funds that would ensure any children we had would never want for anything. I began to suspect that David's reluctance about children wasn't really about timing or finances, but about something deeper. He seemed uncomfortable around his friends' children at social gatherings, and when the topic of babies came up in conversation, he would quickly change the subject. When I tried to discuss it directly, he would become defensive, accusing me of trying to pressure him into something he wasn't ready for. These conversations always ended with him apologizing and promising we would revisit the topic soon, but somehow soon never came. Despite this growing tension about our future family, our marriage seemed solid in every other way. David was attentive and affectionate, still bringing me flowers for no reason, and planning romantic surprises for special occasions. We traveled extensively: Paris for our 5th anniversary, a wine tour through Tuscany the following year, and a safari in Kenya that had been on my bucket list since college. David's parents continued to treat me like the daughter they never had, including me in family traditions and seeking my input on everything from holiday plans to charitable donations. My own business continued to grow, and by our 7th year of marriage, I was earning nearly as much as David, something that seemed to both proud of and occasionally threatened by. He would boast about my success to his colleagues and friends, but I sometimes caught him making subtle comments about how my work kept me busy and distracted from our home life. When I suggested hiring a housekeeper to help manage the domestic responsibilities so I could focus more on growing my business, he immediately agreed, but I sensed an underlying resentment about my increasing independence. It was around this time that I first noticed small changes in David's behavior. He started working later hours, claiming that his client base was expanding and requiring more attention. Weekend trips to the office became more frequent, and he began traveling to meet with clients in other cities, sometimes staying overnight when it seemed like day trips would have been perfectly feasible. When I questioned these changes, he explained that the financial services industry was becoming increasingly competitive, and he needed to go above and beyond to maintain his edge. The changes were subtle enough that I initially dismissed my growing unease as paranoia or insecurity. David was still loving and attentive when we were together, still planning romantic evenings, and surprising me with thoughtful gifts. Our intimate life remained satisfying, and he showed no signs of losing interest in our physical relationship. When friends would comment on how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband, I would agree wholeheartedly, pushing down the small voice in my head that wondered why he had become so secretive about his phone, and why he sometimes came home from work smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. By our 8th year of marriage, David's success at the firm had reached new heights. He was promoted to partner, an achievement that came with a substantial salary increase and profit-sharing arrangement that nearly doubled our household income. We celebrated with a trip to the Maldives, staying in an overwater villa that cost more for 1 week than most people earn in months. David seemed genuinely happy during that vacation, more relaxed and present than he had been in years. We talked about renovating the kitchen in our Queen Anne home, and maybe finally buying that yacht he had always dreamed of owning. When we returned from the Maldives, David threw himself even more deeply into his work. The new partnership came with additional responsibilities, managing junior advisors, developing new business, and maintaining relationships with the firm's most valuable clients. He was often out of town for conferences and client meetings, sometimes for several days at a time. His phone calls home during these trips became shorter and more perfunctory, filled with updates about work, but lacking the personal intimacy that had always characterized our conversations. I tried to be understanding and supportive, knowing that David's career success was benefiting both of us. The increased income allowed me to expand my own business, hiring 2 full-time employees, and moving into a proper office space in South Lake Union. I was landing bigger clients and more complex projects, work that was both challenging and lucrative. On paper, we were the perfect power couple, successful, wealthy, and seemingly happy, but privately, I was beginning to feel like I was living with a stranger. The distance between us became more pronounced during our 9th year of marriage. David's travel schedule intensified, and even when he was home, he seemed distracted and preoccupied. He spent hours on his phone and laptop, claiming to be working on important client presentations or reviewing investment portfolios. Our conversations became increasingly surface level, focused on practical matters, like household expenses, social obligations, and business logistics, rather than the deeper emotional connection we had always shared. I began to feel lonely in my own marriage, a feeling that was made worse by the fact that David seemed oblivious to the growing chasm between us. When I tried to address my concerns, he would reassure me that everything was fine, that he was just under more pressure at work than usual, and that things would settle down once he had fully adjusted to his partnership responsibilities. He would plan a romantic dinner or surprise weekend getaway, and for a brief moment, things would feel normal again. But these interludes became increasingly rare, and felt more like obligations than genuine expressions of love. It was during this period that I started paying closer attention to the small details of our shared life. I noticed that David had changed his phone password, something he had never done in all our years together. He started doing his own laundry, claiming he wanted to take better care of his expensive suits, but I suspected he was hiding something in his clothing. His credit card statements, which had always been left openly on his desk for me to review as part of our shared financial management, were now filed away immediately upon arrival. When David's behavior became even more secretive, I found myself doing things I had never imagined I would do, checking the browser history on our shared computer, looking through his jacket pockets when he was in the shower, and paying attention to his phone calls from other rooms. What I found was mostly innocent, work-related emails, calls with clients, and the normal digital footprint of a successful financial advisor. But there were gaps and inconsistencies that troubled me, times when his calendar didn't match his explanations of where he had been or what he had been doing. The breaking point came just before our 10th anniversary.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us.
Now back to the story. David had planned what he described as a special celebration weekend, a surprise trip to San Francisco that would combine business meetings with romantic dinners and sightseeing. He was excited about the trip in a way that reminded me of the early days of our relationship, and I allowed myself to hope that whatever had been creating distance between us was finally resolving itself. 3 days before we were scheduled to leave for San Francisco, David announced that he had to cancel the trip because of a client emergency. One of his biggest accounts was facing a major financial decision, and David needed to be available for consultations and strategy sessions. He was genuinely apologetic, promising to reschedule as soon as the crisis was resolved, but I could see relief in his eyes that contradicted his disappointed words. It was then that I realized David hadn't been planning a romantic getaway at all. He had been planning to meet someone else in San Francisco, and my presence had been either a cover story or an afterthought. That evening, while David was out at what he claimed was an emergency client dinner, I sat in our beautiful home feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my adult life. 10 years of marriage, and I was married to a man who was lying to me about fundamental aspects of his life. I didn't yet know the full extent of his deception, but I knew with certainty that the marriage I had believed in no longer existed, if it ever had at all. The next morning, as I was transferring David's clothes from the washer to the dryer, a task I had taken back from him because his newfound interest in doing laundry had lasted only a few weeks, I found the hotel receipt that would change everything. It was crumpled in the pocket of his navy blazer, a receipt from the Fairmont San Francisco dated just 2 weeks earlier. The room had been booked for 2 nights, and the charges included not just the luxury suite but also room service meals for 2, champagne service and spa treatments for a couple. My hands shook as I read the details, trying to process what I was seeing. David had told me he was in Portland those 2 days, meeting with a potential client who was considering transferring a significant portfolio to his firm. He had called me both evenings from what he claimed was his hotel room at the Marriott, describing the rainy Oregon weather and his boring room service dinners. But according to this receipt, he had been in San Francisco, staying at one of the city's most romantic hotels, clearly not alone. I sat on the laundry room floor, staring at that piece of paper, feeling 10 years of trust and love crumble around me. The man I had married, the man I had built a life with, the man I had trusted with my heart and my future, had been living a double life. The receipt was proof of infidelity, but more than that, it was evidence of a level of deception that went far beyond a momentary lapse in judgment. This had been planned, orchestrated, and executed with the same attention to detail that David brought to his professional life. As the initial shock began to wear off, it was replaced by a cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. David had been lying to me, manipulating me, and betraying our marriage vows while I had been the faithful, supportive wife, cheering his successes and making excuses for his absences. He had used my trust and love as a shield for his infidelity, and he had done it all while maintaining the pretense of being a devoted husband. But David had made one critical mistake in his careful deception: he had underestimated me. The quiet, supportive wife who had built her own successful business while managing his social calendar and maintaining his home, was not the naive young woman he had married 10 years earlier. I had learned to be strategic, resourceful, and patient in building my consultancy, skills that would serve me well in planning what came next. I carefully placed the receipt back in David's jacket pocket exactly where I had found it. If he discovered it was missing, he would know I had found it, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. I needed time to think, to plan, and to decide how I wanted to handle this betrayal. David was about to learn that the biggest mistake of his life wasn't having an affair, it was underestimating the woman he had betrayed. I spent the next 3 days in a strange state of heightened awareness, watching David's every move while pretending nothing had changed. It was like living in a parallel universe where I was simultaneously the loving wife going through the motions of our daily routine, and a detective gathering evidence of my husband's betrayal. Every kiss goodbye felt like a lie, every casual conversation about his day became an exercise in decoding what he was really telling me versus what he wanted me to believe. David seemed completely oblivious to my internal transformation. He went about his usual routine, with the same confident ease that had always characterized his behavior, discussing weekend plans, asking about my clients, and even suggesting we finally book that kitchen renovation we had been talking about for months. The casual way he maintained this facade of normalcy, while knowing he was betraying everything we had built together, filled me with a rage so profound, it took all my self-control not to confront him immediately. But I had learned patience and strategic thinking through years of building my business, and I knew that acting impulsively would only put me at a disadvantage. David was a financial advisor who made his living by thinking several moves ahead, by anticipating problems and creating solutions before his clients even knew they needed them. If I was going to outsmart him, I needed to be equally methodical and far more careful than he had been. My first step was to establish exactly what I was dealing with. The hotel receipt proved David had been in San Francisco when he claimed to be in Portland, and the charges suggested he hadn't been alone. But I needed to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of deception. I began paying attention to details I had previously ignored, creating a mental catalog of his travels, late nights, and changes in behavior over the past 2 years. I started keeping a notebook, hidden in my office at home, where I recorded everything that seemed suspicious or inconsistent. David's claim, working late on Tuesday, matched a charge on our shared credit card for dinner at an expensive restaurant across town at the same time. His weekend business trip to Vancouver included a car rental charge that suggested he had driven somewhere other than the client meetings he had described. A conference in Phoenix that should have ended on Thursday showed hotel charges through Saturday, with no explanation for the extended stay. The more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. David had been lying to me not just occasionally, but systematically for what appeared to be at least 2 years. The realization that our entire recent history was built on deception was devastating, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't a marriage that could be saved through counseling or communication. This was a marriage that had been destroyed by someone who had chosen betrayal over honesty, manipulation over respect. While I was documenting David's lies, I was also trying to figure out who he was having an affair with. The obvious candidates were women he met through work, either colleagues at his firm or clients who might have developed inappropriate relationships with their trusted financial advisor. David had always been charming and attractive, the kind of man who drew attention wherever he went, and his position of managing wealthy clients' financial affairs would have given him access to women who moved in the same social circles we did. I began paying closer attention to the names David mentioned in casual conversation about his work. There was Jennifer Morrison, a recently divorced tech executive who had transferred her substantial portfolio to David's management 6 months earlier. He had mentioned meeting with her frequently, always describing these meetings in terms of her complex financial situation and need for careful guidance through her divorce settlement. There was also Catherine Wells, the wife of a prominent Seattle surgeon, who had started working with David to manage inheritance money from her recently deceased father. Then there was Rebecca Chen, a successful real estate developer who had been one of David's clients for over 2 years. She was beautiful, wealthy, and according to David's casual mentions, very appreciative of the investment returns he had generated for her. Rebecca was single, having never married despite being in her mid-30s, and David had mentioned more than once how impressed he was with her business acumen and sophisticated understanding of financial markets. The more I thought about it, the more Rebecca seemed like the most likely candidate. David had attended several real estate industry events as her guest, something he had framed as networking opportunities that could benefit both his client base and her development projects. He had mentioned having dinner with her to discuss investment strategies, always in the context of providing exceptional client service, but now I wondered if those dinners had been covers for something more intimate. I decided to do some research of my own. Rebecca's real estate company had a sophisticated website with professional photos and detailed information about her background and current projects. She was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of polished elegance that came from wealth and professional success. Her bio mentioned that she had earned an MBA from Wharton and had built her development company from the ground up, specializing in luxury residential properties in Seattle's most desirable neighborhoods. More telling were the social media photos I found on her company's Instagram account and her personal Facebook page. Rebecca lived the kind of lifestyle that would appeal to someone like David: expensive restaurants, luxury travel destinations, exclusive social events, and a waterfront penthouse that had been featured in architectural magazines. She was exactly the type of woman David had always been attracted to: successful and sophisticated with the confidence that came from never having to worry about money. As I dug deeper into Rebecca's online presence, I found something that made my blood run cold. A photo from her Instagram account taken 3 weeks earlier showed her at a wine bar in Pioneer Square, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakable to someone who had been married to him for 10 years, was David. He was sitting at a corner table, leaning forward in the intimate posture of someone engaged in serious conversation, his wedding ring clearly visible on his left hand. The photo was taken on a Wednesday evening, when David had told me he was having a business dinner with a potential client who was considering moving his retirement accounts to David's management. He had come home that night smelling faintly of expensive perfume, something I had noticed but attributed to the crowded restaurant he claimed to have visited. Now I understood that the perfume had been Rebecca's, and the business dinner had been a lie to cover their romantic evening together. I stared at that photo for a long time, feeling the last remnants of denial finally dissolve. This wasn't just an affair, it was a relationship. David wasn't just cheating on me, he was building a life with another woman, while maintaining the facade of our marriage. The casual way Rebecca had posted the photo, apparently unconcerned about who might see David in the background, suggested she felt secure in their relationship, perhaps even entitled to display it publicly. My hands were shaking as I took screenshots of the photo and saved them to a secure folder on my computer. This was evidence, and I was going to need all the evidence I could gather for what I was beginning to plan. Because David's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was also financial. As partners in our marriage, we had built a substantial estate together, and I was entitled to half of everything we owned. But more importantly, David had been using marital assets to fund his affair, taking Rebecca to expensive restaurants, staying in luxury hotels, and probably buying her gifts with money that belonged to both of us. The next morning, while David was at his regular squash game at the country club, I drove to downtown Seattle to meet with Patricia Hoffman, the best divorce attorney in the city. Patricia had a reputation for being brilliant, ruthless, and utterly discreet, exactly the kind of representation I was going to need. Her office occupied the top floor of a prestigious downtown building, with views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains that reminded me uncomfortably of the scenery David and I had admired from our first apartment together. Patricia was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a way that conveyed both authority and femininity. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad, but mostly focusing her sharp gray eyes on my face, as if she could read the full story in my expressions. When I finished, she asked several pointed questions about our financial situation, David's business relationships, and my own career and assets. After reviewing the hotel receipt and the photos I had found, Patricia leaned back in her leather chair and gave me an assessment that was both encouraging and sobering. I have handled divorces for many high-net-worth individuals, and your situation has several advantages. First, you have clear evidence of adultery, which in Washington state can affect property division, even though we're a no-fault divorce jurisdiction. Second, you have your own successful business and income stream, which means you're not financially dependent on your husband. Third, and most importantly, you discovered this early enough to protect your interests before he has had time to hide assets or make financial moves that could disadvantage you. Patricia explained that David's position as a financial advisor actually worked in my favor because his professional reputation and client relationships were vulnerable to scandal. If word got out that he was having an affair with a client, it could damage his credibility and potentially violate the ethical standards of his profession. This gave me significant leverage in negotiations, assuming I wanted to handle the divorce quietly, rather than through a public court battle. She also confirmed my suspicions about the financial implications of David's affair. Any money he had spent on Rebecca, hotels, restaurants, gifts, or travel, constituted a misuse of marital assets. If we could document these expenses, I would be entitled to reimbursement from his share of our property settlement. Given David's substantial income and our shared assets, this could amount to a significant sum, but Patricia's most valuable advice was about timing and strategy. David doesn't know that you know about the affair, which gives you a tremendous advantage. We can use this time to conduct a thorough analysis of your financial situation, identify all assets and debts, and prepare a comprehensive divorce petition before he has any idea what's coming. When we're ready to move, we can serve him with papers and a temporary restraining order that will prevent him from accessing joint accounts or making any major financial decisions without court approval.
The idea of serving David with divorce papers while he was still living his double life, still lying to my face every day, while planning romantic getaways with his mistress, filled me with a sense of poetic justice that was almost overwhelming. He had been playing a game where he knew all the rules, and I didn't even know I was a player. Now the tables would be turned, and I would be the one with the secret knowledge and strategic advantage. Patricia referred me to Martin Cross, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in high-net-worth divorces. Martin's office was in Bellevue, and when I met with him 2 days later, I was impressed by his methodical approach to financial investigation. He explained that many wealthy individuals attempt to hide money during divorce proceedings, either by transferring assets to family members or friends, establishing offshore accounts, or simply underreporting their income and net worth. David's profession made him particularly sophisticated about financial matters, but it also created a paper trail that would be difficult to conceal from an expert investigator. Martin requested copies of our tax returns for the past 5 years, bank statements, investment account records, and credit card statements. He also wanted detailed information about David's business relationships, client base, and any side investments or business ventures he might have been involved in. As Martin began his analysis, I continued my own investigation into David's relationship with Rebecca. I created a fake social media account and began following her public profiles, looking for any additional evidence of their affair. What I found was even more damaging than I had expected. Rebecca's lifestyle over the past year showed a clear escalation in luxury that corresponded exactly with the timeline of her relationship with David. 6 months ago, she had started posting photos from expensive restaurants that I recognized as David's favorites, places he had taken me for special occasions in the early years of our marriage. 4 months ago, she had taken a weekend trip to Napa Valley, staying at the same exclusive resort where David and I had celebrated our 5th anniversary. The photos showed her in the hotel's signature spa robe, the same robe I had worn during our romantic getaway, making the violation feel intensely personal. Most damning of all was a recent photo from Rebecca's birthday celebration, taken at a private dining room in one of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants. The photo showed an elaborate floral arrangement that I immediately recognized because it was identical to ones David had sent to my office for my own birthday celebrations. He had been recycling romantic gestures, using the same florist, the same restaurants, even the same weekend destinations, to conduct his affair that he had once used to court and romance me. The realization that David had been essentially running 2 parallel relationships, complete with duplicate romantic rituals and gestures, was perhaps more hurtful than the affair itself. It suggested a level of calculation and emotional detachment that made me question whether anything about our marriage had ever been genuine. Had he been performing the role of loving husband the same way he was now performing it with Rebecca, following a script rather than expressing authentic feelings? While I was gathering evidence of the affair, Martin was uncovering the financial scope of David's deception. His preliminary analysis revealed several concerning patterns in our financial records. Over the past 18 months, David had been making regular cash withdrawals from our joint accounts, always in amounts just small enough to avoid triggering any automatic alerts from our bank. These withdrawals totaled nearly $40,000, money that had disappeared without any corresponding expenses in our household budget. Martin also discovered that David had opened a separate credit card account in his name only, something he had never mentioned to me despite our long-standing agreement to maintain complete transparency about our financial obligations.
The statements for this card, which Martin obtained through his investigative resources, showed charges for expensive jewelry, luxury hotels, and high-end restaurants, none of which had benefited our marriage or household. Most troubling of all was Martin's discovery that David had recently changed the beneficiary designations on several of his investment accounts and his substantial life insurance policy. Where I had once been listed as the primary beneficiary, the designations now showed a trust that Martin was still working to identify. This suggested that David wasn't just having an affair, he was making long-term financial plans that excluded me from his future. The evidence was overwhelming, but I still needed to be strategic about how and when to use it. Patricia advised me that we were approaching the optimal time to make our move. David's affair appeared to be intensifying based on the frequency of his lies and the escalating expenses Martin had uncovered. If we waited much longer, he might make additional financial moves that would be harder to reverse, or worse, Rebecca might pressure him to leave me first, allowing him to control the narrative and timeline of our divorce. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to finalize our strategy and prepare the divorce petition. Patricia would draft comprehensive papers seeking dissolution of our marriage, an equitable division of all assets, and restitution for the marital funds David had misappropriated to conduct his affair. She would also prepare a motion for temporary restraining orders that would freeze all joint accounts and prevent David from making any major financial decisions without court approval. Martin would continue his forensic analysis to ensure we had identified all assets and could prove the full extent of David's financial deception. He had already found enough evidence to support claims of asset dissipation and breach of fiduciary duty, both of which could significantly affect how our property would be divided. As for timing, Patricia recommended that we serve David with the papers on a weekday when he would be at his office, maximizing the professional embarrassment and ensuring he couldn't retreat to the privacy of our home to plan his response. The process server would deliver the documents directly to him at his firm, in front of his colleagues and clients, making it impossible for him to continue maintaining his facade of respectability. I spent that weekend going through our home with new eyes, mentally cataloging everything we had built together over 10 years of marriage. The artwork we had collected during our travels, the furniture we had carefully selected for each room, the wine collection David had been building in our basement, the expensive electronics and appliances that represented the material success of our partnership. Everything would need to be valued and divided, transformed from shared possessions into weapons in a legal battle I had never wanted to fight. But more than the material possessions, I found myself mourning the loss of the future we had planned together. The kitchen renovation we had been discussing, the yacht David wanted to buy, the children we might have had if he hadn't kept finding reasons to postpone starting a family. All of these dreams now felt like lies, manipulations designed to keep me invested in a marriage that had become a convenient cover for his real relationship with Rebecca. On Monday morning, I watched David get ready for work, with the knowledge that it would be one of the last times I would see him as my husband rather than my adversary. He kissed me goodbye with the same casual affection he had shown every morning for 10 years, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. As he walked out our front door in his perfectly tailored suit, briefcase in hand, I felt a mixture of sadness for what we had lost and anticipation for the justice that was finally coming. By noon that day, David Richardson would know that his carefully constructed double life had collapsed, that his betrayed wife had been far more strategic and resourceful than he had ever imagined, and that the comfortable existence he had been taking for granted was about to become a very expensive mistake. The call came at exactly 12:15 in the afternoon. I was in my home office reviewing a client presentation when my phone buzzed with David's number. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity about his reaction to being served with divorce papers overcame my desire to avoid him entirely. When I picked up, I could hear the barely controlled panic in his voice, despite his attempt to sound calm and professional. "Sarah, I need you to come to my office immediately. There's been some kind of misunderstanding, and we need to discuss it privately before this gets out of hand." His voice had the tight quality it got when he was trying to manage a crisis while maintaining his public composure, the same tone he used with clients when their investments took unexpected downturns. "I'm in the middle of a client meeting," I lied smoothly. "What kind of misunderstanding?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear him calculating how much to reveal over the phone versus how much to save for face-to-face manipulation. Someone delivered some papers to my office, claiming that you filed for divorce. Obviously there's been some mistake, probably identity theft, or a clerical error at the courthouse. We need to get this sorted out immediately, before it affects my professional reputation. The audacity of his response was breathtaking. Even confronted with legal documents bearing my signature and detailed accusations of his infidelity, David's first instinct was to gaslight me, to convince me that I hadn't actually done what I had clearly done. His concern wasn't about our marriage or my feelings, but about protecting his professional image from the consequences of his own actions. "I'll be there in an hour," I said calmly, then hung up before he could respond. I wanted him to spend that hour stewing in uncertainty, wondering what I knew and how much evidence I had gathered. After 10 years of being lied to, I was finally the one controlling the flow of information in our relationship. I took my time getting ready, choosing a navy blue business suit that projected confidence and authority. I wanted to look like the successful businesswoman I had become, not the wounded wife David probably expected to see. I applied my makeup carefully, styled my hair in the elegant updo I wore to important client meetings, and selected jewelry that conveyed wealth and sophistication. If this was going to be our final confrontation as husband and wife, I wanted David to see exactly what he was losing. The drive to David's office in downtown Seattle gave me time to mentally prepare for what would undoubtedly be an Oscar-worthy performance of wounded innocence and righteous indignation. David was skilled at manipulation, capable of making his victims feel guilty for questioning his behavior or demanding accountability. But I was no longer the trusting young woman he had married. I was a successful entrepreneur who had learned to navigate complex negotiations and handle difficult personalities. More importantly, I held all the cards in this particular game. David's office was on the 30th floor of one of Seattle's most prestigious financial buildings, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the city and Puget Sound. The reception area was decorated with expensive artwork and fresh flowers, designed to convey the kind of old-money sophistication that wealthy clients expected from their financial advisors. The receptionist, a young woman named Amanda, whom I had met at several company functions, greeted me with obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Richardson," she said, her voice strained with the awkwardness of the situation. "Mr. Richardson is waiting for you in his office. He asked not to be disturbed during your meeting." I could see the curiosity in her eyes, the barely suppressed gossip that would undoubtedly spread throughout the office within hours of my departure. David's carefully maintained professional image was already beginning to crack. David's private office reflected his personality perfectly. Immaculate, expensive, and designed to impress. His mahogany desk was positioned to take advantage of the stunning view, flanked by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The walls displayed his various professional certifications, awards from industry organizations, and photographs of him with prominent Seattle business leaders and politicians. He was standing behind his desk when I entered, still wearing the charcoal gray suit he had put on that morning, but his usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. The divorce papers were spread across his desk like evidence at a crime scene, and I could see he had been through them multiple times, based on the way they were arranged and annotated. His face was pale, and there were stress lines around his eyes that I hadn't noticed that morning. "Sarah, thank God you're here," he said, coming around the desk with his arms extended as if to embrace me. "I need you to explain what's happening. Someone has obviously stolen your identity and filed these fraudulent documents. We need to contact the police immediately and get this straightened out before it causes any more damage to our family." I stepped back from his attempted embrace, maintaining the distance between us both physically and emotionally. "There's been no identity theft, David. I filed for divorce this morning, and those papers are entirely legitimate." I kept my voice level and professional, as if I were discussing a business contract rather than the end of our marriage. The expression on his face shifted from feigned confusion to genuine shock. He had clearly been convinced that he could manipulate me into believing I hadn't taken the action I had obviously taken, that his powers of persuasion were strong enough to overcome documentary evidence. When he realized that approach wasn't going to work, I watched him mentally pivot to his next strategy. Sarah, you're obviously upset about something, and we should talk about it, but filing for divorce is an extreme overreaction. Whatever problem you think we have, we can work through it together. We've been married for 10 years. We've built a life together. You can't just throw that away over some minor misunderstanding or temporary difficulty. Minor misunderstanding, I repeated, allowing a note of ice to enter my voice. Is that what you call your affair with Rebecca Chen? The 2-year relationship you've been conducting while lying to my face every single day? The $40,000 in marital assets you've spent on hotels, restaurants, and gifts for another woman? David's face went through a series of rapid changes. Surprise, calculation, and then a kind of desperate defiance. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're completely wrong. Rebecca is a client, nothing more. Any expenses related to her are legitimate business costs associated with providing exceptional service to one of my most important accounts. Really? I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out printed copies of the evidence I had gathered. Because this hotel receipt from the Fairmont San Francisco shows you stayed there for 2 nights when you told me you were in Portland. This Instagram photo shows you having an intimate dinner with Rebecca when you claimed to be meeting with a potential client. And these credit card statements show thousands of dollars in charges for jewelry, flowers, and romantic dinners that never benefited our marriage. I laid each piece of evidence on his desk methodically, watching his face grow paler with each revelation. David was a smart man, and he could see that I hadn't stumbled onto his affair by accident. This was the result of careful investigation and strategic planning, and he was beginning to realize that his situation was far worse than he had initially understood. You hired someone to spy on me, he said, his voice taking on an accusatory tone. You violated my privacy, went through my personal belongings, and conducted some kind of surveillance operation against your own husband. How is that any different from what you're accusing me of doing? The sheer audacity of his attempt to turn himself into the victim was almost amusing. David had been caught red-handed conducting a systematic affair, misappropriating marital assets, and lying about his activities for 2 years, yet he wanted to make me the villain for discovering his deception. It was a perfect example of the manipulative behavior that had probably characterized our entire marriage, though I had been too trusting to recognize it at the time. What I did was protect myself from a husband who was stealing from our joint accounts to fund his affair, I replied calmly. What you did was commit adultery while lying to me about your whereabouts, your activities, and your feelings. The difference should be obvious even to you. David sat down heavily in his desk chair, finally seeming to grasp that his usual tactics weren't going to work. The confident, controlling man I had married was being replaced by someone who looked desperate and cornered, like a gambler who had just realized his bluff had been called and he didn't have the cards to back it up. Okay, he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. I made a mistake. I got involved with Rebecca, and it went further than it should have. But it doesn't mean anything, Sarah. You're my wife. You're the one I come home to every night. You're the one I built this life with. Rebecca she's just excitement, something different. It has nothing to do with my feelings for you, just excitement. I repeated, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to remain controlled. You've been having an affair for 2 years, David. You've taken her to restaurants where we had anniversary dinners. You've used the same florist for her birthday flowers that you used for mine. You've recreated our romantic getaways with another woman. That's not excitement, that's replacement. The truth of what I was saying seemed to hit David like a physical blow. He had been caught not just cheating but systematically transferring the romantic rituals of our marriage to another relationship. There was no way to minimize or excuse that level of calculated betrayal, and we both knew it. What do you want? He asked. Finally, his voice small and defeated. Money, a bigger settlement. We can work this out without destroying everything we've built. Think about our reputation, our standing in the community. Think about what this will do to both our careers if it becomes public. I want exactly what I've asked for in those divorce papers, I said, gesturing to the documents spread across his desk. An equitable division of all marital assets, reimbursement for the money you stole to conduct your affair, and a clean break from a marriage that you destroyed with your lies and betrayal. David's expression hardened, and I could see him mentally shifting from the role of repentant husband to that of adversarial opponent. You'll never prove that the money I spent was inappropriate. Business entertainment is a legitimate expense, and any gifts or dinners can be justified as client relations. Your forensic accountant might find suspicious patterns, but proving misappropriation in court is a much higher standard. He was right that proving asset dissipation could be challenging, but he was overlooking several critical factors that would work in my favor. Patricia had explained that Washington state judges took a dim view of spouses who used marital assets to conduct extramarital affairs, especially when those affairs involved systematic deception. More importantly, David's professional reputation and client relationships were vulnerable to exactly the kind of scandal that a public divorce proceeding would create. You might be willing to roll the dice in court, I said, standing up and gathering the evidence I had shown him. But are you prepared for your clients to learn that their trusted financial advisor has been conducting a 2-year affair with another client? Are you ready for the Seattle business community to know that you've been lying to your wife while using joint assets to fund romantic getaways with your mistress? The color drained from David's face as he realized what I was threatening. His entire career was built on trust and professional integrity. Wealthy clients didn't just want good investment returns. They wanted advisors whose personal lives were as stable and trustworthy as their professional recommendations. A messy divorce involving infidelity and financial impropriety could destroy the reputation he had spent years building. You wouldn't, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You have too much class, too much dignity to air our private problems in public. You're not the kind of person who seeks revenge through public humiliation. You're absolutely right, I replied, moving toward the door. I'm not interested in revenge or public humiliation. I'm interested in justice and fair compensation for the betrayal and financial damage you've caused. If you're reasonable in our settlement negotiations, this can be handled quietly and professionally. If you try to fight me or hide assets, then yes, everything becomes public record in divorce court. I paused at the door and turned back to face him one last time. You made a choice, David. You chose to betray our marriage vows, lie to me for 2 years, and steal from our joint accounts to fund your affair. Those choices have consequences, and now you get to live with them. The only question is whether you want to handle this with dignity, or make it as painful and expensive as possible for both of us. David's office felt different as I walked out than it had when I arrived. The expensive furnishings and impressive view that had once represented his success now seemed like stage props in a performance that was finally ending. The receptionist avoided eye contact as I passed her desk, undoubtedly aware from David's behavior that something significant had just occurred. The elevator ride down 30 floors gave me time to process what had just happened. I had confronted the man who had betrayed me, presented him with irrefutable evidence of his deception, and made it clear that I was prepared to fight for what I deserved. There had been no dramatic breakdown, no emotional scene, just the cold presentation of facts and consequences. It felt appropriate for the end of a marriage that had apparently been more business arrangement than love story. My phone buzzed with a text message as I reached the parking garage. It was from Patricia asking how the confrontation had gone, and whether David had indicated any willingness to negotiate. I typed back a brief response. He knows he's caught. He'll try to minimize financial exposure but won't want this to go public. Expect settlement discussions within a week. As I drove home through the Seattle streets that had been the backdrop for 10 years of marriage, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The life I had thought I was living had been an illusion, but at least now I knew the truth. David had chosen Rebecca over our marriage, excitement over stability, deception over honesty. Those were his choices to make, but they were also his consequences to bear. The house in Queen Anne looked different when I pulled into our driveway, less like a home, and more like a piece of valuable real estate that would need to be appraised and divided. I walked through the rooms we had decorated together, remembering the conversations about color schemes and furniture placement that had once seemed so important. Everything would need to be cataloged, valued, and either kept or sold as part of our divorce settlement. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing client files and trying to return to some semblance of normal business routine. My consulting company had been my refuge throughout this ordeal, the one part of my life that David hadn't contaminated with his lies. My clients depended on my expertise and judgment, and maintaining those professional relationships was crucial both financially and emotionally.
Around 9 o'clock, David came home. I heard his car in the driveway, his key in the lock, his footsteps in the hallway. He knocked softly on my office door, a courtesy he had never extended before our confrontation that afternoon. When I didn't respond, he spoke through the closed door. "Sarah, we need to talk about how we're going to handle this situation. I've spoken with my attorney, and he thinks we can reach a reasonable settlement without a lot of publicity or expensive litigation. I'm prepared to be fair about the division of assets, and we can work out the other issues privately." I opened the door and looked at him standing in our hallway, this man who had shared my bed and my life for 10 years while systematically betraying everything we had built together. He looked older than he had that morning, worn down by the realization that his carefully constructed double life had finally collapsed. "Your attorney can call my attorney," I said simply. "All communication about our divorce goes through them from now on. I don't want to discuss settlements, property division, or anything else related to our legal proceedings. You made your choice when you decided to have an affair. Now I'm making mine." David nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding that there would be no tearful reconciliation scene, no dramatic forgiveness, no opportunity to charm or manipulate his way out of the consequences of his actions. The marriage was over, not because of anger or revenge, but because trust, once broken so completely, could never be repaired. 3 weeks later, I signed the final divorce settlement in Patricia's office. David had agreed to my terms almost entirely, giving me the house, half of all investment accounts, and reimbursement for the money he had spent on his affair. His attorney had advised him that fighting would only make the situation more expensive and public, exactly the outcome he wanted to avoid. I never saw David again after that day in his office. He moved in with Rebecca within a month of our divorce being finalized, and they were married 6 months later in a small ceremony that made the society pages of the Seattle Times. I felt nothing when I read the announcement, not anger or sadness or jealousy, just the mild interest one might have in the lives of distant acquaintances. The house in Queen Anne became truly mine, renovated and redecorated to reflect my tastes rather than our compromised choices. My consulting business flourished, perhaps because I was finally free to focus entirely on my own success rather than supporting someone else's career. I traveled to places David and I had never visited, learned skills I had never had time to pursue, and built friendships based on honesty rather than the social obligations of being part of a couple. 2 years later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that David and Rebecca's marriage was struggling, that the same patterns of behavior that had destroyed our relationship were manifesting in his new one. Apparently, the excitement of an illicit affair doesn't translate well to the mundane realities of daily married life, and David's tendency toward deception hadn't been cured by changing partners. But their problems were no longer my concern. I had learned that the most powerful revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation, but simply living well, building a life based on truth rather than lies, and refusing to let someone else's poor choices define your future. David had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted, and I had gotten something far more valuable: my freedom, my self-respect, and the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect myself when protection was needed. 5 years have passed since that confrontation in David's office, and I'm sitting in the sunroom of my renovated Queen Anne home, watching the morning light dance across Elliott Bay. The space looks nothing like it did when David and I lived here together. Gone are the neutral colors and compromise furniture we selected as a couple. Instead, the rooms reflect my personality entirely: bold artwork from local Seattle artists, comfortable furniture in rich jewel tones, and plants everywhere because I discovered I have a gift for keeping things alive and thriving. My consulting firm now employs 12 people and has expanded beyond Seattle to serve clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. Last month, we were featured in Forbes as one of the top emerging marketing consultancies in the region. The success feels different than anything I achieved while married, and it's entirely mine, built on my decisions, my vision, my willingness to take risks that David would have cautioned against as too aggressive or unpredictable. The irony isn't lost on me that my professional life flourished most dramatically after I stopped seeking input from the financial expert I was married to.
David had always been supportive of my business in theory, but his advice consistently steered me toward conservative choices that limited growth potential. Without his voice in my ear suggesting I slow down, be more cautious, or wait for better market conditions, I discovered I had an appetite for calculated risks that paid off handsomely. 3 years ago, I started dating again. Michael Santos is a pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital, divorced with 2 teenage daughters who spend alternate weekends at his Capitol Hill townhouse. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honest conversations about our past marriages, our career ambitions, and our desire for partnership rather than codependency. Michael knows about David's affair and the divorce proceedings, but he's never pressed for details beyond what I chose to share. His approach to relationships is refreshingly straightforward. No games, no hidden agendas, just genuine affection and respect. What surprised me most about falling in love again was how different it felt from my marriage to David. With David, I had been constantly trying to be the perfect wife, anticipating his needs and adjusting my behavior to maintain his approval and attention. With Michael, I can simply be myself, successful, opinionated, independent, and he finds those qualities attractive rather than threatening. We maintain separate homes and finances not because we don't trust each other, but because we've both learned the value of preserving individual identity within a romantic partnership. Last summer, Michael and I took a trip to Italy, visiting the same regions David and I had explored during our 5th anniversary. I was initially hesitant about returning to places that held memories of my failed marriage, but the experience was surprisingly healing. Seeing those beautiful cities and countryside through different eyes, with someone who appreciated my enthusiasm for art and culture rather than merely tolerating it, helped me reclaim experiences that David's betrayal had tainted. The financial settlement from my divorce provided the foundation for investments that have grown substantially over the past 5 years. I work with a different financial advisor now, a woman named Jennifer Liu, who encourages aggressive growth strategies and never questions my business instincts. The portfolio she manages for me has outperformed the conservative approach David always advocated, proving that his professional caution was perhaps more about maintaining control than maximizing returns. I've also discovered a passion for mentoring other women who are navigating divorce, particularly those dealing with financial deception or emotional manipulation. Patricia Hoffman occasionally refers clients to me when they need support from someone who has successfully rebuilt after betrayal. These conversations are always confidential, but I find deep satisfaction in helping other women recognize their own strength and develop strategies for protecting their interests. One of the most valuable lessons I share is the importance of documentation and independent financial awareness. Too many women enter divorce proceedings without complete knowledge of their marital assets or evidence of their spouse's deceptive behavior. I encourage every woman to maintain her own credit, keep copies of important financial documents, and trust her instincts when something feels wrong in her marriage. About 18 months ago, I received an unexpected call from Rebecca Chen. She and David were divorcing, and she wanted to meet for coffee to discuss what she called shared experiences. I was initially reluctant, having no desire to revisit that chapter of my life, but curiosity eventually won out. We met at a neutral cafe in Fremont, 2 women who had been connected by the same man's capacity for deception. Rebecca looked different than she had in her professional photos and social media posts. The polished confidence had been replaced by something more vulnerable and uncertain. She apologized for her role in destroying my marriage, though she claimed she hadn't known David was married when their relationship began. According to her version of events, David had told her he was separated and in the process of divorcing his wife, who had supposedly been unwilling to accept that their marriage was over. I listened without judgment as Rebecca described a pattern of behavior that was disturbingly familiar. David had been secretive about his finances, controlling about her social media presence, and increasingly critical of her business decisions. He had pressured her to merge their companies in ways that would have benefited him more than her, and he had begun monitoring her communications with clients and colleagues. The man she had fallen in love with during their affair had gradually revealed himself to be someone who viewed relationships as opportunities for control and manipulation. Most telling was Rebecca's description of David's reaction to her success. Her real estate development company had flourished during the first years of their marriage, but David became increasingly resentful of her achievements and the attention they brought her. He began undermining her confidence, questioning her judgment, and suggesting that her business success was threatening their relationship. The pattern was identical to subtle behaviors I had noticed during my own marriage, but had dismissed as stress from his demanding career. Rebecca's divorce from David was messier than mine had been, complicated by business entanglements and David's attempts to claim credit for her company's growth during their marriage. She had been forced to hire both a divorce attorney and a business lawyer to untangle the financial web David had woven around their relationship. The process was expensive and emotionally draining, exactly the kind of battle I had avoided by having comprehensive evidence and leverage when I confronted David. After our coffee meeting, I felt a mixture of validation and sadness. Validation because Rebecca's experiences confirmed that David's treatment of me hadn't been personal. It was simply his approach to relationships, a pattern of control and manipulation that he repeated with each partner. Sadness because another intelligent, successful woman had fallen victim to his charm, and spent years of her life discovering who he really was beneath the polished exterior. I never heard from Rebecca again after that meeting, but through Seattle's interconnected business community, I learned that she eventually relocated to Portland, where she rebuilt her company and her life. Her experience served as a reminder that David's betrayal of our marriage hadn't been about my inadequacy as a wife or partner. It had been about his character and his approach to relationships as transactions to be managed rather than connections to be nurtured. Last month I attended a charity gala, where David and his third wife were also present. She's younger than both Rebecca and me, a marketing executive at a tech startup, who bears an uncomfortable resemblance to how I looked when David and I first met. They appeared happy in the performative way that David had always excelled at, playing the role of successful couple for their social circle. But I noticed the subtle signs I had once ignored. How he positioned himself slightly ahead of her in photographs, how he answered questions directed at her, how her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at him. I felt no anger or jealousy watching them together, just a profound sense of gratitude that I was no longer the woman standing beside David Richardson, playing a supporting role in his carefully constructed public image. The woman I had become, confident, successful, genuinely happy, was someone David never could have appreciated or supported, because her strength would have threatened his need for control. My story isn't unique in its basic elements. Spouse discovers affair, hires lawyers, gets divorced, rebuilds life. What made the difference was recognizing that I had agency in how the story ended. I could have confronted David emotionally, demanded explanations and apologies, tried to save a marriage that had been destroyed by systematic deception. Instead, I chose to treat his betrayal as a business problem requiring strategic solution. The approach served me well financially and emotionally. I emerged from my divorce with my dignity intact, my finances secure, and my confidence in my own judgment restored. More importantly, I learned that my instincts about people and situations were more reliable than I had realized. The subtle signs of David's deception had been there all along. I had simply been trained by our relationship dynamics to doubt myself, rather than trust my observations. Today, as I prepare for another day of running my successful business and building my authentic relationship with Michael, I'm grateful for the lessons that betrayal taught me. Not because suffering has inherent value, but because surviving it with strategic thinking and self-respect intact proved to me that I was stronger and more resourceful than I had ever imagined. The woman who found that hotel receipt 5 years ago was devastated by her husband's betrayal. The woman who confronted him with evidence and demanded justice was discovering her own power. The woman writing this story today understands that the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It's simply living well, making choices based on your own values, rather than someone else's manipulation, and refusing to let anyone else's poor character define the limits of your happiness. Sometimes the most profound victory is simply walking away from people who don't deserve access to your life, building something better in their absence, and never looking back with regret. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.